Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. Justin Williams joins me as usual to provide the individual mineral owner perspective. Hey, Justin.
Hey, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being on the show. In this episode, we're going to cover mineral rights news for February 2020. But before we get started, please subscribe to the show and leave an honest rating and review on whatever podcast player you're using. And as always, you can find the show notes at mineralrightspodcast.com, where there'll be links to the articles we talk about today. And if you have a question you'd like us to answer on an upcoming episode, please send an email to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com. And let's go ahead and dive in. Justin, why don't you read the first article?
So our first story here is about Colorado, and we'll dive right in. So despite Proposition 112's loss, Colorado's fracking foes are back with 6 new ballot measures. On Tuesday, Colorado Rising, the state's leading anti-fracking group, announced it had submitted language for 6 new ballot initiatives to state election officials. 5 of them are either replicas or close cousins of Proposition 112, which lost in the midterm election. The other would require oil and gas companies to post a far more extensive bond for new wells. The money would help to manage state so-called orphan wells the industry leaves behind. If any of the initiatives make the ballot, Colorado voters could be at the center of another brawl over oil and gas development. The industry poured nearly $40 million into defeating Proposition 112, claiming the plan amounted to a statewide hydraulic fracturing ban. TV ads and billboards proclaimed that Colorado's economy hung in the balance. Any of the proposals would need 124,632 valid signatures to earn a place on the ballot. In a written statement, Dan Haley, president for the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, said Coloradans should decline to sign these petitions. This is deja vu all over again. Last election, Coloradans decisively defeated an energy industry ban that would have shredded private property rights and put working families on the unemployment line. Now, keep it on the ground activists are back, pushing the same extreme measure and a few 112 lights, he said. In 2018, Colorado voters soundly defeated an attempt to move oil and gas drilling 2,500 feet away from homes and waterways. It appeared the loss hasn't deterred the state's fracking opponents. We wanted to take into account the feedback we got in the 2018 election cycle. So you'll see that reflected in different versions we've submitted, said Ann Lee Foster, a spokesperson for Colorado Rising. Colorado Rising does not plan to run all of the ballot initiatives. By taking a shotgun approach, the group hopes to gauge which measure has been the best chance before voters in November. So this is an interesting one, Matt. Like it mentions, it's kind of deja vu and coming back around, but I think we'll see it defeated again if it does come to the table.
I hope so. And one of the interesting things about Colorado Rising is there's the same organization that introduced Proposition 112 on the ballot in 2018. And so this just goes to show that these anti-oil and gas industry activists really aren't going to stop until the industry is shut down. And like Dan Haley mentioned with the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, that despite Coloradans defeating these measures in the past, they're just not going to stop until everything is shut down. Now, the thing that's really interesting about this is Colorado Rising checked the Colorado Secretary of State's website, and they, as of January 15th, 2020, they only had around $17,000 on hand. So it's yet to be determined whether or not they're just using this as a ploy to get some publicity and to stay relevant and just to let the industry know that they're still out there, or if they're actually intending on collecting the necessary signatures to get this on the ballot in the fall. When you think about how much they spent in 2018, the financial records on the Secretary of State website showed they had around $1.2 million in the 2018 election cycle when 112 was on the ballot. So it's going to take a lot more than $17,000 to try to push this through. I think what they're doing is just trying to rattle the cage in the oil and gas industry, just let folks know that they're not going away. And fortunately, it's something that we're going to have to continue to deal with, and something that, keep an eye on the initiatives that are, whatever state you're in. There's others that are out there that are potentially looking to do similar things in other states. So definitely educate yourself and learn about the real intent behind these different ballot initiatives.
Absolutely. All right, our next story here. Should mineral right owners get paid if the government blocks oil development on their land? So, this story is from Denver. Eminent domain requires government to pay property owners for the land that they take. What about when government gets in the way of what's underneath a property owner's land? This is my probably fourth or fifth time that I have stood for mineral right owners and property right owners, said Colorado State Rep. Perry Buck. For the fourth or fifth time, Buck failed to convince the state legislator that local government should reimburse mineral owners, oil and gas companies for moratoriums or fracking bans. It's a property right argument. If they're going to put a highway in your front yard because they believe that highway is so important that they're going to put the highway in, you're going to be compensated for them using your front yard. So this is no different, said Buck. I don't think it's unreasonable for any citizen to request payment from a government when they deny or take property away or do not allow you to use your property, said William Windler, a property and mineral rights owner in Aurora. The Windler's family has owned land in eastern Aurora for 140 years. In conjunction with the surface of the property, we've also owned mineral rights since basically statehood, said Windler. He has agreements with 2 oil and gas companies for some of the minerals under his land, but he said the city has slowed the process for one of those agreements. And no matter how long it takes for the company to get all the permits and approvals, he's not owed a thing from the city, county, or state. This is causing a lot of financial concern with us because lawyers aren't cheap and working with the city to go through all of these processes. Now dealing with an ever-increasing bureaucracy, you have the state, now you have the city, you have all of the other regulatory requirements that are in place, and it seems sometimes one doesn't know what the other is doing, said Windler. So this is a really interesting take, Matt, and something that I think mineral owners would be happy about, but definitely not a precedent that's been set that I'm aware of.
Yeah, it's not a precedence that's been set in Colorado. And the article goes on to say that it was kind of a moot point because the bill died in committee, which is not that surprising considering the democratically controlled state legislature. The other interesting thing is that the bill that Buck introduced was looking to compensate both mineral owners and then oil and gas companies as well. And you wonder if that might have been part of the rub. And so perhaps if this had been worded more in favor of just mineral owners and excluding the oil and gas companies themselves, that could have helped. But the real issue is if a local government, which the recent changes to the COGCC require more involvement from local governments, and if they end up delaying the development of oil and gas, then that's one thing. But another issue is really just if there were an outright ban, or if a local government were to decide to not allow an operator to develop minerals in a certain area for whatever reason, then I think certainly there would be a strong case for a government taking claim. And in that case, I would imagine that you'd see lawsuits that would follow, and it would be tied up in a legal battle, and then you wouldn't get a precedent set either way until that decision was made. Certainly, I think it's a valid point that the mineral owner in Aurora brings up, that if the value of the property is decreased because of government action, I could see on to that being considered a taking, because the time value of money and how sensitive the value of minerals is to when they're going to be developed. And so if you're pushing that out by years or decades, then maybe there is a case for a government taking, and just even from a time standpoint. So really an interesting article, and something we're, I think, going to be faced with once the COGCC rulemaking is complete, and when we see really how it's implemented and kind of what the result is. And it may end up that there are some lawsuits that come out of that because of the unhappy mineral owners that feel that the value of their property has been negatively affected.
Absolutely. All right, our next story here is about Elizabeth Warren's gas royalties. She talks if oil stains everything it touches. What about her family's Oklahoma gas rights? So, on the first day as president, Elizabeth Warren says she will ban fracking everywhere while putting a total moratorium on leases offshore and on federal lands. Ms. Warren has signed a pledge to refuse campaign contributions over $200 from the oil and gas industry, and she's a past sponsor of a Senate bill called the Keep It in the Ground Act. So it's worth noting that for years, she and her husband reported modest income from natural gas royalties in her native state of Oklahoma. Ms. Warren's financial disclosure filed with the Senate in 2012 included $504 of income from gas well royalty interest in Latimer County. The next year, it was 203. Drill a little deeper, and the facts get even more interesting. Ms. Warren's campaign has posted 11 years of her tax returns, which show gas income from at least 2008. The year she filed jointly with her husband, Bruce Mann, who had about $872 in royalties from gas wells in Oklahoma. There are smaller amounts, a few $100s, reported over the next several tax returns before the yearly earnings stop. Property records offer further information. Although the picture is hardly complete, a 2011 deed says Mr. Mann sold his interest in all of the oil, gas, and other minerals under assorted pieces of land in Latimer and Pittsburgh County. The stated price was $5,000. The buyer, Alexander Warren, the senator's son. The deed is dated August 19th. It says the transfer of the royalty was effective September 1st. 2 weeks later, September 14th, Ms. Warren announced her Senate candidacy in Massachusetts. There are more transfers in 2014 as Ms. Warren's political profile was rising. We are on the cusp of a climate crisis, she told the Senate that March, a point of no return that will threaten our health, our economy, and our planet. 2 months later, deeds dated May 19th said Ms. Warren conveyed to her two children, Alexander and Amelia, her mineral rights for lands in Okfuskee County and Hughes County amid the Woodford Shale field in the state's southeast. I apologize if I did not pronounce those correctly. One of those Hughes County parcels appeared on oil and gas leases from June and July of 2017, signed by Alexander and Amelia along with Ms. Warren's three brothers. The agreements allow exploration and drilling on an 80-acre plot in exchange for royalties on any potential output. The leases had an initial term of 3 years, so they would appear to remain in effect through the summer. So this is definitely an interesting one, Matt, especially when a politician is saying that they're so against something, but I don't think terribly surprising either.
Yeah, it's not surprising that a politician is contradicting themselves, like the article suggests. The article does go on to say, what makes this curious is that it belies the purism of her presidential rhetoric. She speaks as if oil inevitably stains everything it touches. We want to make a real progress on climate, Warren said in a November debate. Then we have to start by attacking the corruption that gives the oil industry and other fossil fuel industries a stranglehold over this country. A month later, she added, the biggest problem we face is the politicians in Washington who keep saying the right thing but continue to take money from the oil industry. It's hard to differentiate what she's saying from her actions, and while maybe she's not directly continuing to take that money from the oil industry, she's just transferred it to her kids just so that would avoid the appearance of any conflict. But one things that I think it does highlight is it goes to show that you really can't always take what politicians say at face value. I think that's probably a given to most people. Really need to do your research and the due diligence on these candidates and what they stand for. What I do know is if the outright fracking ban that she and Bernie Sanders are proposing could have a devastating impact to the economy in the U.S. I do know that the oil and gas industry, at least according to the API in 2015, contributed 10.3 million jobs and over $1.3 trillion to the economy. And for reference, that year in 2015, that represented about 7.6% of the overall GDP in the United States. This is according to this report that they had PricewaterhouseCoopers prepare. And it doesn't sound maybe like a real big number, but when you look at it and they break it down by each of the states, and if you look at some of the top oil and gas states, Oklahoma, Texas, North Dakota, for example, including many others, you're talking more than 20 percent of the overall employment share of the state total, so fifth or more, and a quarter in some cases, you're going to impact that many people, and just from a impact on labor income and the amount of value-added services that the industry provides, or the value-added services that the industry purchases, it could have a devastating impact on some of these local economies. And so I think it's really important that we sit back and think about, this transition to a clean energy future. And in my mind, oil and natural gas in the U.S. has to play a critical part in that transition, at least until we get sustainable and economically feasible alternatives up and running. And until then, and as long as we're driving cars and flying in airplanes, I think we're going to see oil and gas play a large role. I think it's short-sighted to simply shut off the industry in the U.S. What's going to happen is it's just going to push that supply to other countries globally that aren't concerned about the environment, that aren't taking the precautions that we're taking here in the U.S. and producing responsibly, and also that frankly just don't have the same values in place around human rights and women's rights and things like that. So if we really value those things, I think it would be silly to shut off the industry in the U.S. But really interesting article. A lot more of that to come, I imagine, with the election season coming up. So stay educated.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that wraps it up for our February news story so far.
That's it for this week. And as mentioned at the top of the show, please subscribe and share, and also leave us an honest rating and review on whatever podcast player you're listening to the show on. And as always, you can find the show notes at mineralrightspodcast.com, where we'll have links to these articles and to the API study that was done. And if you have any feedback, or if you come across any articles you'd like us to cover on a future episode, please send an email to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com. Thanks again for listening.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.